Welcome, everyone. We are now going to talk about the chapter of grasses and pastures. Grasses and pasture was a chapter edited by Sara Invernizzi, one of our team members. Unfortunately, she couldn't participate today because she's teaching a workshop in person in a valley in a mountain nearby in Italy, but she's sending her greetings, and the work that she has been doing with us has been critical in understanding the nature of our spaces in the valley, as she's studying also rituals and some other traditions that are in a way the specialties also of Sabina Magliocco, that came in the Year of the Woods, but has been invited to talk with us and write about something on the grasses and pastures, and she will be the second speaker today. Sabina is a professor of anthropology and the chair of the interdisciplinary program and study of religion at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. But she was previously, when we also met her, working and teaching in Southern California, and has been a long time friend. And she's Italian American, so she knows Italy quite well, in specific Sardinia, but the jump in joining us and coming to Taleggio made us really appreciative of her, even ethnobotanic, as an ethnobotanist, the connection with grasses and pastures. So thank you, Sabina, for joining us. You will be the second speaker. And the first one is Colin Sage, a professor now retired and continue to do independent research, and published several books, but on the issues of food and the interconnection of food system and planetary Earth and human well-being. We met Colin when he visited our valley and participated in a special and specific program that was dedicated to the cheese making. Our valley is known for the name of the cheese, Taleggio, and also another important to us, but is produced in a smaller quantity, so it's not so well known cheese named Strachitund. And we are really pleased to have Colin today to tell us about, his vast experience of food systems and the kind of ups and downs of the demand on that. I'm going to, and after the two presentations, we will open up again to also the fellows that have been writing and participated to the third essay of the chapter, The Voices. So it's going to be, again, a dynamic hour. And I thank everybody for joining. And Colin, I'm going to share your screen, or you sharing yours? You're sharing yours, right?
I'm sharing mine, yeah.
Wonderful. Welcome. And Colin is at the moment calling from Portugal, if I'm not wrong. So he's adding to
You're not wrong. Okay. Thank you, Ilaria, very much, and greetings to you and to Sara in absentia, and to everyone else involved in the exercise. It's been it was a real privilege to be invited to contribute to the exercise, to the book, and somewhat of a surprise to be asked to do something on grass. And like I think many people, we probably have not given sufficient attention to the role of grass and pasture in our food and in our environment. So in some ways, it was an opportunity for me to engage with a biome which I hadn't really fully acknowledged, and so the exercise was very interesting in that respect. I want to, rather than to deepen an understanding of grasses, there's no way I'm able to even speak about the botanical dimensions of this. It's going to be more a broadening exercise to kind of situate what I regard as certain threats that might face upland agriculture, where grass plays a predominant role in rural livelihoods. So in other words, I'm also really concerned not just with the environmental dimensions of grass production and pasture in general, but also the livelihoods that they support, the local livelihoods, farmers and their families, and other labor, which contributes to which draws upon grass, but also then gives rise to the iconic products such as cheeses, such as Stracciatont and Valtaleggio cheese, which Ilaria mentioned. I was involved in that meeting. I mean, without being too foreboding here, I think it's necessary to first of all acknowledge that we have to contextualize what's going on around this biome, grasses and pastures, in an era of what I call climate breakdown. I understood Kelly speaking of global warming, but in fact, atmospheric heating is only part of the whole process of the breakdown of climate and what we might consider to be planetary instability. Now, in some ways, we can throw up our hands in despair and say we're all going to go, we're all going to die anyway, but whether that will be sooner or later. But the thing is, I think that the value that I attach to this exercise is that it's giving us an opportunity to dialogue with people with whom we might not meet. I mean, I come from an academic background, so I don't get a chance often enough to meet with creative people. And so for me, this whole opportunity has been fantastic to discover what other people are thinking around this stuff. And the fellows' contributions at the end of that chapter on grasses and pastures, I found, very, very insightful. But we are where we are, and the fact of the matter is, climate breakdown is happening, and the fact that we probably don't acknowledge sufficiently the contribution of the food system to that process. So the food system as a whole is estimated to contribute about 30% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. But of course, it goes beyond that. It goes beyond just actually greenhouse gas emissions. There's a whole set of land use changes that are driven by agriculture and biodiversity loss and habitat destruction and so on and so forth. I mean, it's worth reminding ourselves that I think Kelly mentioned that that only something like 29% of the world's of the surface of the earth is actually covered by land. The rest is water, and of that surface of the land, so 30% of the world is actually land. 71% is under agriculture. So we already utilize a huge proportion of the Earth's surface to grow food, and it's contributing significantly to this process of habitat destruction, of species loss, and so on and so forth. So we have to think closely about that. And this in the time when, of course, we're concerned about this process of atmospheric warming and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and so on. But what it brings forth is a series of solutionist proposals, some entirely technological, entirely disconnected from any sense of what are the human consequences of these, and high-tech solutions are very much of the moment, and there's a great deal of uncertainty around all of this. But one of the things I think we need to be aware of is the degree to which upland agriculture, upland pastures and grasslands may well be on the receiving end of some of these proposals. And I'll be talking particularly briefly about the call for rewilding of upland agriculture, of upland areas, and the implications that might have for farmers in those environments. So we might consider this as part of a process of ecological restoration. Now, the issue, I suppose, that I want to highlight is the way the food system itself is managed and is proceeding. And in the context in which, I mean, it's most explicit now in the United States, of course, with this retrenchment of public policy, the slashing of federal spending on all sorts of things that we regard as necessary for human life. But really, all governments, including this side of the Atlantic, have been engaged in this idea that somehow public policy is to be pulled back, that we should allow the market to prevail and to make the determining factors. And of course, there's this preoccupation with trade, globalization. Okay, at the moment, the language is around tariffs and so on. But, you know, this prevails in relation to food rather than in other considerations, such as dietary health, such as, well, what about food culture? And I was picking up occasionally in some of the other contributions to the book reference to this idea that food is also a commons. We should regard food as a commons rather than only as food as a commodity. And I was involved in an exercise book a couple of years ago, which was called Foods as a Commons, which brings together a number of authors. It was edited by Olivier de Schutter, the ex UN special rapporteur on the right to food. And the idea that the commoditization of food has been proceeding, and it has marginalized ourselves really as consumers, is simply making distinctions between products that invariably have very little to distinguish between them other than labels. And that our food system has become dumbed down, and we've lost a lot of our agency around food. So in some ways, part of the exercise that we're engaged in here is partly to call for greater agency around things like food. I think we're alert to the fact that there are competing narratives around food. I mean, one of the powerful narratives, of course, that comes from the food industry is that we have to produce more food to feed more people. This is sort of a neo-Malthusian kind of argument that is made. Of course, we produce enough food now to feed 10 million people. The fact that 2 million people don't get access to enough food is not because of a lack of food, but it speaks to a whole set of issues around accessibility and so on. We won't go there. But one of the other narratives that are going on, and there's a significant discourse and contested discourse, is around livestock and meat, of course, and the question of whether or not we should be reducing our meat consumption. Now, you know, as someone who already has done that significantly, I mean, this seems to me a no-brainer, as we say, that we do need to find ways of reducing our meat intake. But of course, the question then is, how will we do that? And this is where we find Silicon Valley beginning to re-emerge again in this space of novel foods and alternative proteins. And I was involved in a recent exercise at the American University in Rome, where we held, well, in February, a symposium to really launch a special issue of a journal which was all around alternative proteins. There's a big debate going around all of that. I contributed the paper on technological solutionism, and it's being regarded in some ways by some, even people that we would think would know better, as the only solution to our predicament. That it's a solution to our environmental crisis. It's a solution to the fact that so much of the land is occupied by animals, and that meat contributes so little to our, you know, our necessary. I mean, it provides some essential vitamins and minerals. Iron is a particularly important one. B12 we know, but elsewhere we get most of our protein needs already through plant-based products. So there's a big debate around all of this. What this alternative proteins, novel foods, and you probably know enough around when I'm talking about cell-cultured meat. I'm thinking about plant-based proteins, and also the use of insects. Those aren't really going very far. The use of precision fermentation processes. There's a whole set of technologies around synthetic biology, effectively, which brings with it a whole set of genetic manipulation and so on. We won't need to worry about that. But of course, it also feeds into this half-Earth strategy, which seems to us to be something that we would welcome, conserving half the Earth's lands to protect the Earth's biodiversity. And it's felt that if we could do that, we could protect something like 85% of potential extinctions. So there's an issue around some of this, which we would be very much in favor of developing. My argument is that it's quite likely that we would be thinking about, you know, what economists often think about is competing bid rents. and some of the more valuable land in the lowlands, which is very intensively farmed to grow, basic foodstuffs, is unlikely to be on the receiving end of these changes. And I would argue that it's quite likely to be upland environments that are going to be required to redirect their land uses from something like grazing, for example, to either reforestation for carbon capture and sequestration, or for massive rewilding schemes and so on. I mean, some of that rewilding we would welcome. It's already underway, but there's already a debate in the Italian Alps about the degree to which we can allow wolves and bears to run around when we also have people running through these trails and being, finding themselves face to face with these animals. So there are issues about all of that. This all has spin-offs for how we see upland environments in the future, and that's something that I think we should consider. Ilaria mentioned the meeting that was held. I mean, the meeting was held in Vallebromana on the weekend of the COVID-19 outbreak in Bergamo. So, I mean, the thing that I remember most about this event 5 years ago was the chaos that happened at the airport trying to leave. And it was a pretty significant moment. But the event itself, in which I was contributing, was very, very interesting. I just wanted to say, before we get too romantic around upland farming, I should say that part of the exercise of this weekend then was to go and visit some farmers and to see cheesemakers in action, as it were. But I was struck when we went to visit a dairy producer on his farm, the degree to which he had adopted a high level of mechanization. So there was robotic feeding systems in place, for example. So he had a robot moving up and down the line of stall-fed cattle. I mean, it was still probably too early in the year for them to be out on grass anyway. But this kind of equipment represents quite an investment. The other thing that I was struck by was the stockpiles. I mentioned it in the chapter, but the stockpiles of dextrose monohydrate, which is a sweetener which is used to mix with cattle feeds and so on, in order to make that feedstuff more palatable. Now, in some ways, that doesn't to say that this is it's a problem. But given cheese making pays a lot of attention to the quality of the milk that goes into the process, it's interesting what protocols were in place with regard to the additives that were involved in that feedstuffs. But this is not a kind of a prejudicial argument. This is an argument that says for milk producers like himself, he was already under pressure to increase output. And this is, of course, what this speaks to, the treadmill of productivism, the treadmill to which farmers, even in the uplands, are having to be on to maintain their production. So this is all something that I think we have to appreciate. I just wanted to sort of say, though, because to counter that, of course, upland agriculture exists across Europe, and in the Serra da Estrela here in Portugal, we have some fine cheeses being produced from Bordelera sheep, these sheep running through the meadow there. And that milk then being used, coagulated with dried cardoon flowers. Now I know Sabina will talk much more about those kind of the herbs and the importance of those kinds of things when she speaks. But this speaks to the indigenous knowledge that also applies to cheesemakers, the value that they attach to the quality of the milk and to the quality of the local ingredients to produce, as this cheesemaker does here, a very fine cheese. And so, Serra da Estrela cheese is a really highly regarded soft sheep milk cheese, which which finds its way across. So it's not just the Italian Alps that we should be concerned here. These are common issues that we face across Europe in upland areas. So the question, I suppose, as I come to a conclusion, is the word is resilience. And I don't know, it's been on my lips all week because we went through this extraordinary blackouts last Monday in which the whole of Spain and Portugal lacked any kind of power. And you begin to ask, what is the resilience of our electricity grids that somehow can find it? About 10 hours of electricity blackouts across the whole peninsula, 60, 70 million people. And in relation to resilience, in thinking about it in upland farming, how do we find ways to enhance the resilience of upland farming and reduce or reverse the process of increasing marginalization? I think the important thing is, and that's where the value of taking a food systems perspective comes, is to appreciate just how far the food system drives the agricultural treadmill. And that means that no farmer is immune from being close to that treadmill, to being on it, to being asked to run faster and faster, to invest more in technology, to increase productivity, to shed labor often in pursuit of reducing costs in order to increase output and so on. So we have to be alert to the pressures that farmers are on. But of course, beyond being food producers, beyond producers of milk and cheese and other things, they're also stewards of rather fragile environments. And I was in Trento just a couple of weeks ago, actually speaking at a couple of meetings in Trento at the university and elsewhere. And one of the interesting issues that I found that was being discussed was, the infrastructural impact associated with the Winter Olympics of 2026. There's a lot of building going on, a lot of infrastructure going on into the high mountains in order to be able to create, I don't know, I've never paid much attention to Winter Olympics, given living in more temperate environments. But these bobsleigh courses and so on all have huge implications, but also is driving greater numbers of people into the higher mountains, into tourism. And of course, we have, as we know, increasing amounts of infrastructure, changing the nature of the upland environment. The other thing I'd say, there's a lot of resource extraction going on as well, not just in terms of minerals. We have a big debate going on here in Portugal about some lithium deposits that seem to be in national parks, and and these are upland areas, and whether there should be access to these lithium deposits, because God knows we all now need lithium. And so those are issues. But I was also struck by looking at a documentary that was on RTP television this week, the Portuguese one, the Portuguese national television. And it was talking about the closure of a small factory near Valença in the north of Portugal, where mostly women were working in component assemblies. And there's a kind of quite a large automobile assembly industry, not putting the cars together, but putting bits of cars together, dashboard stuff, and all these bits of plastics. All of this has to be assembled by hand. One of these companies was closing down, and the whole point of this documentary was that these women were going back to their farms to survive on small flocks of sheep or small herds of cattle. So in some ways, we're also seeing upland areas being what we used to call, in Marxist terminology, the reserve army of labor. We don't use that term anymore, but a reserve army of labor where, people somehow are brought into the capitalist system when there are opportunities, and then when things change, they're let go, and then they fall back into their rural farms as ways of subsisting, really, in that respect. And I think it's important to regard upland areas as providing a habitat, if you like, for labor, which can be drawn backwards and forwards as circumstances demand. And that's not a good thing necessarily. I'm not suggesting it's an optimal idea, although it does present a way that people can survive. So the question I would ask, I suppose a series of questions, is that if we are concerned about grasses and pastures in upland environments, how can we better support those environments? How can we better support the stewards that maintain them? And I think that means that we have to consider ourselves much more as ecologically conscious food citizens, not as end-of-pipe consumers. That means paying more attention to what we're buying, to the foods that we're eating and so on, and trying to, I think, much more make connections with farmers directly. I mean, Italy has probably the best experience in this through the gas arrangements. I mean, these are things that other societies have been looking at, haven't easily replicated. I mean, gas itself, difficult to maintain them given all the other pressures upon people's lives. But nevertheless, that offers one possibility. I think we also need to be challenging high-tech solutionism and its promiscuous appropriation of terms. And what I mean by that is the way that we see proponents of alternative protein, for example, saying this is the only game in town, this is the only technology that stands between us and existential catastrophe. You know, we're the most sustainable thing, you know, that you could possibly imagine. Writers like George Monbiot, who's well known in the UK, you may not know his name, he's an environmental writer. He's very much has taken the red pill and gone over to that side, and speaks as precision fermentation as being, you know, absolutely essential for our survival. But we also need to find ways of defending the integrity of artisan crafts and quality products, and that puts us in something of a you know, conflict, I think, potentially with these high-tech alternatives. Building durable alliances with farmers, in some ways thinking about reterritorializing our food systems. That means not just means thinking about eating locally, but it means about putting food into place, into space, and valorizing the ecological services that support those foods, the endogenous knowledge which is needed, and ways of also improving our dietary health. And I think in the way that some of the other contributors to this book have done, I think taking a more than human approach to food systems is a very valuable approach. And it recognizes, I suppose, the interconnectedness of humans and nature, and also, I think, highlights the contribution of grasses and pastures to planetary equilibrium. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Colin, very much. Sabina, thank you. We are going to transition to Sabina and come back to conversations after. Sabina, do you want me to? You're sharing, right? Okay, thank you. I forgot. We don't hear you, Sabina, yet. I don't know if you're.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Yes.
And I should probably enable the camera. Hang on a second. I might have to unshare for a second. Do this. Okay,
Yes.
now you should be able to see me, and
You
I'm
do.
going to share again. All right.
And you want to share the full screen.
Okay. And
Perfect.
okay. Hopefully everybody can see this now.
We do.
Yes. Okay. All right. Very good. So as Ilaria said, first of all, thank you for the privilege of presenting, of being a part of this book, and of being a part of the NAHR story. My experience at NAHR was in the summer of 2016 when the topic was the woods. And so I didn't focus exclusively on grasses, but I was very interested in how people used and related to plants that included the fields and the areas that were marginal to the woods. As Ilaria explained, I'm an anthropologist and a folklorist. My approach is ethnographic, which means that I work from the bottom up. I talk to people and try to find out how they feel about things. And I tend to focus on expressive culture and religion and spirituality. So some of the other groups that I've worked with are Highland pastoralists in Sardinia, and the impact of the tourist economy and globalization on their festivals and other forms of expressive culture. And then I'm also probably best known for my work with New Age and Neo-Pagan movements in the West. So I brought this kind of orientation to the work that I did in the Valtaleggio. And I'm interested in how people who have sustainable lifeways, how they conceptualize their relationship to nature and the other than human. So anthropologists studying indigenous cultures, for example, have observed that when traditional peoples live in a sustainable manner, and not all traditional peoples live sustainably, but many do, But the ones that do so because they have a deep knowledge of their environment, combined with emotions and ideas that are encoded in their cosmology. Now, we're currently living in a state of climate crisis that's been created by the Western extraction of natural resources. So it's hard to imagine that these kinds of attitudes and ways of life, ways of looking at things once existed in the West. But in fact, they did. And one of the places that they existed is the Valtaleggio. Um, Europe's inner areas and Europe's marginal areas, like the Valtaleggio, like Highland Sardinia, were characterized in the pre-World War II economy by small-scale subsistence, horticulture, agriculture, and pastoralism. And specifically in the Valtaleggio, you had high-altitude transhumant bovine pastoralism, meaning that the cows were moved to the higher pastures as the summer got warmer, so that they could continue to eat those fresh grasses that are so essential for the production of milk that then turns into taleggio, strakitunt, and these other local cheeses. But in addition to small-scale horticulture and agriculture and pastoralism, people also engaged in household-based foraging. In other words, people would go into the woods, into the fields, into the hedgerows, and gather edible materials to supplement their diet. We're going to talk more about that a little bit later. This way of life required a very strict dependence on nature and its cycles. People needed to have a lot of what we call traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, that governed every aspect of life. And what anthropologists have found is that high levels of TEK are associated with sustainable practices, with a concern with conservation of resources, and with long-term planning for the future. In other words, not an extractivist perspective, but one that looks to the sustainability of the environment and of a way of life. So I want to begin by looking at the fields and the woods as sources of sustenance. As someone interested in expressive culture, I'm very interested in proverbs. And a proverb that I heard repeatedly when I was in the Valtaleggio was "Il bosco non costa niente, ma dà tutto," meaning the woods costs nothing, but gives us everything. And another one that I heard that is similar is "Il bosco dà anche la minestra." So the woods also gives us soup, meaning the woods are a source of food. So the woods, the fields, the pastures were really important sources of food for the inhabitants of the Valtaleggio, and really for all small-scale agriculturalists, horticulturalists, and pastoralists throughout Western Europe. Birds, small mammals, and deer were hunted for meat. Nut trees like walnuts and hazelnut trees provided an additional important source of protein. Wild berries were gathered from the hedgerows during the late summer to eat as fruit or to preserve as jam and jellies. And a variety of wild greens were gathered in the early spring and cooked like spinach or used in sauces for pasta and gnocchi. These added fiber, vitamins, and minerals to the diet. And these are just a few of the greens that folks told me that they gathered in the Valtaleggio. One of them are the cuy, or Good King Henry, Bilitus bonus Henricus, which are used for all kinds of things, from making green gnocchi to pasta sauces to frittatas and they were in season in June when we were in the Valtaleggio. So this is one that I also enjoyed very much. So in addition to sustenance, the fields and pastures and woodlands also provided medicine, healing, as well as a source of income. In Sottochiesa, there was a pharmacy that belonged to the Biava Salvioni family, and the pharmacy paid local people to gather various types of herbs and plants that were used in compounding, in the manufacture of medicine. And here the sisters Costantina and Genoveffa Vitari of Vedeseta were absolutely invaluable interlocutors, because when they were young, they would gather healing herbs and plants in the woods to sell to the pharmacy. Some of the things they gathered included gentian, purple gentian, which was used to make um, a medication that was useful in healing fungi and skin infections. Rue. Let's see. I have some of these things here. Hang on a second. Elderflowers, flax seeds, chamomile, mallow, gentian, which I've also already mentioned, and rue. And in addition, during the holiday season, they gathered moss and mistletoe and other material that could be sold for the making of presepi to people who lived in Bergamo and in other cities. So we see again the fields and woods used as a source of a different kind of sustenance. These herbs had to be gathered at the right time, when the part that was used to make the medicine was at its most potent. And that meant that the young women who did this work were familiar with the plant's life cycle and its relationship to the broader seasonal cycle. In gathering practices, my interlocutors emphasized the principles of sustainable harvesting. The point was never to raid a forest or despoil the fields, but to take only in proportion to one's need, always thinking about the future of the plant, the fact that the plant had to regenerate so that there would be more of it the following year. In this way, the ethos at the center of the relationship between the valley dwellers and nature was similar to the one described by Potawatomi ecologist Robin Wall Kimmerer, whose characteristic and is characteristic of indigenous North American cultures and indeed indigenous cultures in many parts of the world. The woods, fields, and pastures also had symbolic value through their association with the sacred. Many customs and traditions recognized the animate qualities of plants, fields, and natural features, and involved rituals to propitiate them, bringing good luck and plentiful harvests. While some of these rituals existed under the auspices of the Catholic Church, others were part of informal, unofficial culture and were preserved through oral tradition. These types of rituals probably date to a time before the introduction of Christianity, before Christianity replaced the indigenous religions of these mountains and valleys. And they mark important times in the year cycle. They're connected to that. So we find that there are sacred places in the fields and pastures, as well as in the woodlands, often springs, places where water bubbles up out of the ground, and these are often marked with religious shrines. But I also want to talk about the custom of l'erogazione. This is a spring custom, a Catholic custom in which a procession winds its way around the borders of a town's agricultural fields and pastures to bless them, usually around the time of the spring equinox, the official arrival of spring. These are marked by prayers, songs, and acts of personal devotion that are thought to protect the crops and lead to a good harvest. They're another way that the natural and the spiritual worlds are connected in the Italian Prealps. In addition to these formal Catholic customs, there are more informal customs, like the one of chiamar l'erba, which means calling the herbs. In calling the herbs, this custom also took place around the beginning of March, where groups of young boys called marziroi, or March boys, would run out into the fields making as much noise as possible, often banging pots and pans and tooting horns and yelling and doing other things that young boys love to do, to wake up the plants that would provide pasture for livestock and food for villagers who had endured a long winter without access to fresh vegetables. At these times, villagers would also exchange colored eggs and flower crowns as symbols of new life. And in the preceding weeks, girls would gather flowers and herbs that were used in the dyeing of eggs and the making of these flower crowns. The symbolic association of the return of spring with the youngest members of society, the young boys and the young girls, through their teens, the adolescents who represented the source of the culture's renewal as they formed couples and eventually new families, demonstrates how intertwined relationships with nature were with social relationships. Plentiful herbs meant a good harvest, plentiful milk from well-fed cows, enough food to last another winter, and abundant resources so that life itself could continue. The towns and villages of the pre-alpine valleys could thrive. Anthropologists have often observed that some cultures with animistic ontologies, in which humans are on the par with nature, they are part of nature rather than separated from it, and maintain reciprocal relationships with other than humans, tend to have more sustainable, resilient relationships with nature than cultures in which humans are completely separated and do not have this reciprocal relationship with nature. Some of these elements, as we've seen, were present in the traditional culture and lifeways of the Val Taleggio. Is it possible to reclaim some of these aspects of this worldview in our modern relationship with the fields, pastures, and woodlands? And this is what I ask in this part of of my chapter and of my presentation. Some cultures have some of the things that characterize these animistic ontologies that anthropologists talk about include the idea of humans as part of nature and of other than human elements, trees, plants, grasses, animals, greater than human spirits, as persons worthy of respect, with whom reciprocal relationships can be established. Reciprocal relationships are relationships that are social in nature. They mirror our social relationships. So is it possible to reclaim some of these aspects of animism in our modern relationships with nature and the woods? And here I looked at a number of different types of ways that these relationships are being reclaimed in the Val Taleggio. This rediscovery of nature as animated and sacred is an important source of the reclamation of traditional ecological knowledge and nature more generally in the 20th and 21st century by environmentalists and by what are called the new animists. So I want to look first at the reclamation of ways of living on the land. And one of the people that I talked to is Virginio Rota, who is a biodynamic farmer from Vedeseta. Virginio told me, nature gives to me. I must give back in return. He is finding inspiration in traditional relationships with the land, and he specializes in growing heirloom local fruit and vegetables on his plot at San Michele near Vedeseta. He calls himself a biodynamic farmer, and he uses techniques he developed based on traditional Val Taleggio farming practices, including the use of compost, crop rotation, companion planting, and planting based on the phases of the moon. Virginio's relationship with trees, plants, and the land preserves something of the traditional reciprocal relationship with other than human world, characterized by the pre-capitalist way of life of his grandparents in the Taleggio Valley. In his ontology, plants are individuals, just as are all animals, including humans. They each have personhood and an ability to communicate. He told me, some people think I talk to plants, but that's not true. The plants talk to me. And he walked me through his apple orchard and pointed to different trees as individuals and asked me what I thought the trees were telling him. And in each case, he was able to point to things about the tree and say, you know, this tree is suffering because it has a fungus. It's had too much moisture, and this tree is old and needs to be pruned back, and things like that. It was so clear that he knew each individual plant and tree that he cared for as a person. His worldview is an example of the continuation and further development of a relational epistemology involving the land and other than humans upon it that is rooted in the past, but developed with an eye towards a more sustainable future. Other groups in the Val Brembana who are engaged in reclaiming practices to re-enchant the world and bring about a more sustainable way of life include neo-pagans, practitioners of new religious movements inspired by the pre-Christian religions of Europe and the Near East, as well as by indigenous religions. By adapting elements of ancient practice to today's needs, they hope to reconnect to nature, the sacred, and community. They often identify as members of nature religions in that they believe the sacred is immanent in nature and the material world. And their practices center around seasonal cycles of birth, growth, maturation, death, and rebirth. Since the majority of members of these groups are urban, however, they mostly live in Bergamo, most did not grow up practicing reciprocal relationships with other than humans, except perhaps with their pets. The problem then becomes how to establish such relationships in the absence of any traditional ecological knowledge or customary praxis. They're divorced from these practices that, for example, Virginio is reclaiming. So modern pagans use a variety of imaginative techniques to develop relationships with other than human beings in nature in order to re-enchant the world. In participating in activities that enhance the reality of other than human entities, modern pagans may develop ontologies that are more animistic than naturalistic. These ontologies decenter humans, putting them on the par with other creatures, both material and spiritual, who inhabit the planet. Now, while we would think that this would lead pagans to adopt lifestyles that are more sustainable and resilient in the face of environmental crisis, the actual results are mixed. So neo-pagans often lack traditional ecological knowledge. They don't know about practices rooted in a more sustainable way of life, and they're embedded in systems of global capitalism, making sustainable living difficult to achieve. Urban and suburban pagans remain dependent on fossil fuels and global markets for most of their necessities. So, to conclude here, epistemologies and ontologies of human-nature relationships should not be thought of as mutually exclusive. Many societies have hierarchies of ontologies, with some preserving a level of animism, coexisting comfortably with others based on religious and scientific views. So it's important, I think, to build our cultural capital through exchanges of knowledge and practice with different communities engaged in the natural world. How cool would it be, for example, if we could give some of the neo-pagans living in the Val Brembana, in Bergamo and its suburbs, exposure to some of this traditional ecological knowledge which their ancestors in this region may have practiced and which agriculturalists like Virginio Rota are bringing back today. So I think that that bringing groups of people together, educating people, and the kinds of personal relationships with agriculturalists that my predecessor here, Professor Sage, mentioned are ways that we could begin to build that kind of sustainability, that kind of resiliency in a number of different environments. Personal relationships with nature are linked to more sustainable practices, leading to greater resilience and to a greener future. So, combining praxis-based knowledge with imaginative techniques might yield the best hope for a more sustainable future in the face of global environmental crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabina, very much. Who knew that there were so much to say about grasses, right? And it's fascinating how they can bridge all these different cultures, the conversation and their importance in our food chain. And even though we are closer to the hour already, I would like to make sure that we also open up to an even more possible point of view and conversation. And some of the fellows that were part of the Year of the Grasses even gave words to the grasses themselves. So they animated the grasses, and I know that Dave Chan had to leave soon. I don't know if he's there and I would like to make sure that we represent a few of the voices, and from that perspective, even from the more than human. And Dave and Siobhan did two projects that perhaps we have a chance to briefly mention. Dave, are you there? Sorry, I'm.
I am, yes, thank you.
Yes. Hi. Nice.
Hello.
Hello. Do you see the screen? I'm sharing the images of your mountaineers exploration. Do you see it?
Wonderful memories. Yes, I do. Thank you.
Yeah, I was curious, if you could tell us about the booth and the idea behind the giving voices to the grasses that you had when you came. It would be wonderful.
Sure. As you were mentioning, it was kind of an anthropomorphization of the grasses, and I had the idea kind of the transhumance of the traveling of the cows from the lower to the higher pastures, and put myself in the same position of extensively traveling the trails in the mountains. I think it was several hundred kilometers over the 4 or so weeks that I traveled and documented, and then built a chatbot to represent the grasses as the documentation would be represented in the background. So I don't know if that all makes sense, but I had built a website to house the documentation and the chatbot that was a representation of the grasses. So the bot itself was speaking on behalf of the grasses.
Yes, that is a website, and I will briefly, as I said, we are gonna maybe go over the hour of a few minutes, Maristella, just as just to give voice, since we had two speakers in this case. I wanted to make sure that we, this is Dave's original website where he has the project where you guys can chat with the grasses if you feel like, right, David?
I'm not sure that it still works because the technology moved so fast that about a year later, some of the systems that I used weren't live anymore.
Yeah. But it's still fascinating, the opportunity that technology, which is another aspect, I would say, of NAHR work, to we also have many fellows that are actually from the medias, and they use technology as a way of exploring the world, and so giving voices to the grasses in this way was fascinating to see, even if it was just a glimpse, and as we learned, the technology moved to that. But I think maybe, thank you, David, for quickly sharing that. And maybe Siobhan, you could also share with us your understanding or relationship to the grasses in the idea of commons that connects to the landscape that we have seen in the photographs taken by David and of David.
Yeah, thanks. So I think that when I came, one of the other themes that for the summer was the sort of thinking about possibilities of a circular economy, especially in circular economy in terms of the cheese industry in the valley. And on arrival, really getting to experience moving. I did not do as much walking at all as David, but like the multiple layers, the multiple levels of elevation. And we were there at a time when the cattle were being moved up to the higher pastures. And so there was this kind of movement going up and down. And so thinking about the sort of like kind of role of the grasses themselves, the kind of input into the system that the chlorophyll were participating in. The other thing that kind of really I thought was like like an amazing glimpse into other forms of governance when we were there, also learning about how people decide who's grazing in which areas in which year. And so that idea of like that there is actually a commons still being held to a certain degree within the usage of the pastures. And so I was, I'd been thinking about governance a lot for other reasons, and ended up kind of trying to sort of imagine a way that that these different kind of stages of elevation could meet one another. And the only place that really takes place fully is in the stomachs of the cattle as they make this movement. So that was kind of like a little bit of the joke at the at the origin point. And so what I worked on was writing a declaration of sovereignty of the pastures and the grasses, and thinking about how they are related to one another. And it was all kind of several documents composed of the founding documents of how they would organize themselves to communicate with one another. And so the mapping was looking at all of the grasslands of the valley, and thinking about that as a kind of a unified place that exceeded the kind of governance borders that people had placed on the region. And so, yeah, I was also writing these documents by hand using chlorophyll extracted from the grass at each elevation. So they were kind of getting materially put together. So I don't know if that gets us what you were hoping for, Ilaria, or here want to point
it's just to come, the chapter of the voices is also, very, very rich, and there are so many glimpses of little thoughts and big thoughts represented in a small space. And I was, the pages are cut out in this presentation, so sorry if I made you jump around, but I think what is fascinating, as both you and David in different ways, looked at our anthropocentric way of looking at food in a way, and agriculture and the land also, right? And there are also in the chapter that connects to the soil chapter, where Marilyn writes at the indigenous way of understanding the land versus the westernized idea of owning the land. So this connection with the commons also that we can read throughout the book is so important in what we appropriate or we think we own, and how we relate to that sense of ownership. I think in then many of the discussions it percolates. But it's open to any thought and anybody else. Thank you, Siobhan, and if you have other thoughts, of course. This was just to jump in to express that. We are past the hour, but because we had multiple speakers and was so rich, I just wanted to take a few more minutes. And sorry if we couldn't really have a full conversation with Colin, a full conversation with Sabina. Your chapters and your knowledge is so deep and vast. Hopefully, we can go back and read the essays and come back in different times also. This is more kind of a quick excursion throughout the richness of the book and the provocations, including, some of the performing arts that was performed in the grasses and in the pasture by some of the fellows. So it's really a panoramic view of the opportunities of looking at the world in many ways. As Colin said, not all of us are in communication with other disciplines as often as we could, or perhaps would stimulate conversations. So I see also, Julia, you are there, and we have 1 more hours to continue the conversation into woods, but brings back some of these same topics in a way, and certainly the work of the artists. So anytime you like to jump back, please do so. It doesn't matter so much the title of the hour and the chapter, but I would like to take a minute to thank you all for this particular segment, especially Professor Colin Sage and Professor Sabina Magliocco for their insights and, again, the richness of the conversation. Sorry we ran out of time. But if you can stay, we can perhaps, with the help of Maristella also, that will take the lead in this next conversation, get us to continue to look at this Earth continuous surface that takes us from water to land to soil to pastures and now to the woods. We are taking 1 second to change slides, Maristella, and I'll be